Most Mac game ports are pretty simple. Take an existing Windows game, run it through a compatibility layer like Wine, make some UI tweaks, and you're most of the way towards a half-decent Mac version. This approach often leads to performance and stability issues, but it's a reasonably easy way to convert a popular game to Mac OS. But with the advent of Apple Silicon, Apple's custom ARM-based Mac SoCs, we're starting to see a different approach. A handful of popular games have been released or are planned for release for Macs with Apple Silicon, and these are full-blown native versions that use the latest releases of Apple's high-performance Metal Graphics API. With proper ports designed specifically around Apple's hardware and software, these games should work great on Mac. Plus, Apple has been keen to advertise their new performance-boosting tech, dubbed MetalFX, on some of these titles. According to Apple, MetalFX should deliver big frame rate increases while preserving image quality through upsampling lower-res imagery. So we're going to take a look at the first big-budget Apple Silicon port, the recently released Resident Evil Village, to evaluate Apple's claims. Can Mac hardware keep up with comparable PCs? And does Apple's new flavor of image reconstruction really hold its own against native resolution? Resident Evil Village seems like a pretty unassuming Mac port at first glance. It looks like a feature-complete port of the existing game, with little to distinguish it from the existing console and PC versions. But there is something curious nestled away in the settings menu, an option for MetalFX Upscaling, with selections for quality and performance. Apple's initial MetalFX demo videos from June don't exactly impress, showing remarkably simple content that lacks a perceptible increase in detail after scaling. So how does MetalFX work in its first major deployment in Resident Evil Village? To my surprise, it's extremely impressive. This is MetalFX quality at 4K up against native 4K in a challenging scene, with a ton of fine detail, and it's resolving a very similar overall image. Fine elements like tree branches even look more coherent, running with MetalFX. If we zoom in, there is a little bit of additional image blur, but it's not particularly noticeable at normal viewing distances, and the overall image is much more stable. And to my surprise, MetalFX quality counts in at just 1080p when presented at a 4K output. At its core, Resident Evil is rendering a quarter res image, but it manages to mostly pass for native in still shots. Unfortunately, Capcom's TAA implementation on Resident Evil 8 on PC and on Mac is broken and basically doesn't work, so some of the improvement is down to the use of the properly functioning TAA operating in MetalFX quality. But if we drag in the Xbox Series X version of Village, which does have functioning TAA, we can see that MetalFX quality does manage to resolve more texture detail, has cleaner and more refined scene geometry, and features a smoother rendition of many transparencies. This isn't a perfect MetalFX quality versus native 4K comparison, as the Series X is using checkerboarding to resolve a 4K picture, but the results suggest a very capable upsampler. But fairly static images at high resolutions tend to flatter upsampling techniques. So let's scale down the resolution to something more modest, a 1080p output with a 960 by 540 internal resolution, and run through some more challenging image quality scenarios. Still shots again show the strength of MetalFX quality. Side by side with a native 1080p render, MetalFX quality is still delivering results that are about as good as the full resolution version. Texture detail does take a small step down here, but this isn't especially noticeable in general play. Compared against the Xbox One X release, which does feature a full 1080p resolution with working TAA, we see similar results. The MetalFX quality image looks stable and comparably detailed in most circumstances, despite operating with a quarter of the pixel count internally at a resolution that's just barely above standard definition. So what's the catch? MetalFX quality tends to struggle somewhat with transparencies. DLSS 2 and FSR2 can also exhibit some issues with transparent elements, and we see the same sorts of issues here. Hair, for instance, can look smudged and blended together. This baby's head presents ultra-fine hair that is a worst-case scenario for image upsampling, and the results are pretty mediocre. Aliasing is kept to a minimum, but detail resolved pales in comparison to a native presentation. We see similar issues in this field of wheat. The level of detail resolved here is much lower than in native res, and the grass suffers from constant ghosting. Reprojection issues with alpha do crop up with upsampling solutions sometimes, which is a byproduct of absent motion vectors, so this isn't an unexpected issue. At regular viewing distances, it doesn't look quite as bad as this, but it's definitely noticeable and is a substantial step down from native rendering. Moving water also creates problems. This stream's surface is a muddy mess, with ugly, streaky-looking artifacts on the surface, which are again artifacts of reprojection. If you look along the bank here, you'll also notice that the faked checkerboard pseudo-transparency on the snow looks pretty crude as well with MetalFX quality, an artifact of the low internal resolution. But other image quality foibles common to upsampling technologies are mostly absent here. Disocclusion artifacting, for instance, is pretty minimal. In fast movement, objects attached to the player viewport can take on low-resolution, jagged-looking edge detail, but it's not an especially big issue. And even under pretty rapid movement, anti-aliasing coverage and image detail both remained pretty good for the most part, and it was hard to spot any ghosting on model geometry. So MetalFX quality does seem very impressive indeed. I do wish that we had a different MetalFX supporting game to look at instead, however. Resident Evil Village has poor Aaa options on PC, with no support for DLSS 2, XeSS, or FSR2, and has a basically non-functional TAA. So it's hard to compare MetalFX quality with prominent modern upsampling and image treatment techniques. Plus, Resident Evil Village is a pretty ideal game for upsampling, with the first-person perspective and lower contrast artwork minimizing typical image quality flaws. Testing the game's third-person perspective mode might prove illuminating, as I suspect camera movement would create pretty noticeable edge artifacting around the player character with MetalFX quality, but unfortunately the required DLC has not yet been released for the Mac version. MetalFX does have another option in Resident Evil Village, however, which is dubbed Performance. Curiously, this mode still counts at quarter resolution, just like the quality mode, so a 4K output renders at 1080p internally. Unfortunately, image quality is very poor here. The image is swimming in ugly aliasing artifacts that shift considerably from frame to frame, with a low level of stability. When measured up against MetalFX quality or native resolution rendering, the deficits are obvious. If you look closely at certain edges, you can spot the telltale signs that this is a spatial upscaling solution. The warbled and curved edge artifacts here, for instance, are also visible, albeit to a lesser degree, with AMD's FSR1 upscaling tech. This lines up with Apple's developer documentation as well, which lists two MetalFX scalars, a temporal option and a spatial option. With just a single frame as an input, it's difficult to truly enhance detail in an image, though MetalFX Performance does a particularly poor job with edge preservation, which is something that FSR1 manages to do reasonably well. The final output does look quite sharp, but is extremely unstable and artifact-ridden, and in-surface detail is pretty poor as well. Compounding these issues is the fact that MetalFX Performance seems to be operating on top of an image without any substantial anti-aliasing treatment. Enabling MetalFX disables all anti-aliasing toggles, and a lot of edge aliasing remains in the final image in performance mode. It's possible that the game's TAA is technically toggled on here, but as previously mentioned, it doesn't seem to function at all in this title. Image quality is just half the battle with upsampling, of course. So how do the MetalFX options scale in terms of performance? Unfortunately, testing MetalFX within Resident Evil Village presents some significant issues. The game is so light on GPU resources without ray tracing that both of my Apple Silicon Macs, which are an M1 Max based MacBook Pro and an M1 Ultra based Mac Studio, hit 4K 60 fairly easily with any upsampling option enabled. The macOS power options do provide an assist, thankfully, by letting us engage a low power mode that cuts GPU performance roughly in half on our MacBook Pro. And when we do that, we see that the upscaling options have very good performance scaling indeed. I'm using the brand new Metal Performance HUD to show frame rates, frame times, and memory allocation here. At 4K resolution, both MetalFX techniques offer big performance gains. MetalFX quality runs about 70% faster than native res, and performance is about 110% faster, which seems to be a fairly consistent improvement in different scenes. MetalFX quality seems to take a pretty decent chunk of extra frame time to operate here, though keep in mind that we are simulating a lower performance GPU here by restricting power. This is roughly the same margin of frame rate increase you can expect with comparable upsampling technologies at quarter resolution. Like DLSS 2 and FSR 2, MetalFX quality comes in with a substantially higher cost here relative to the performance option, though the massive image quality gains are absolutely worth it. Ultimately, I came away very impressed with Apple's MetalFX quality upsampler. It capably brings a quarter resolution image to a reasonably convincing full res resolve, with minimal artifacting. My only real complaints are problems with certain transparencies, which can show obvious reprojection errors and ghosting. I wish we had another big budget title to test here though, as Resident Evil Village has considerable image quality issues with its other anti-aliasing options, but the results are definitely strong regardless. MetalFX performance is a totally different story. The image quality compromises are vast, even at 4K resolution, with image quality far worse than AMD's FSR1 on PC. Spatial upscalers are limited by nature, but even still this is a poor showing. Perhaps the results would be acceptable in a different title with a high quality TAA running underneath, but I would recommend staying away from this particular option in this game. Resident Evil Village is a lot more than a MetalFX demo, of course, so how does the underlying game hold up on Mac? The settings menu does seem to generally correspond to the options on PC, with just a few changes and compromises. Firstly, the options for ray tracing have been disabled. Macs are capable of running ray tracing, but the level of hardware acceleration is unclear and proper API support was only introduced very recently with the latest version of Metal. So Village doesn't support it. It's not too great a loss, but it's definitely a downgrade from the experience offered on current gen consoles and decent PCs. There's also no support for variable rate shading, though I doubt this feature will be missed by very many people. Outside of those issues and the swapping of the FSR 1.0 option for MetalFX, the settings options are the same. There's still an option for checkerboard rendering, and curiously AMD's other custom tech, including options for contrast adaptive sharpening and CACAO ambient occlusion, are still present and seem to be working. The only weirdness here is the graphics memory allocation. Resident Evil Village reports just 10GB available on both of my Apple Silicon Macs, which have 64GB and 128GB of total unified memory respectively. I couldn't spot any issues from going over this allocation, but your mileage may vary. Measured up against the PC version with the same settings, the Mac release looks more or less identical. Outside of some gamma differences, I couldn't spot any meaningful visual quality changes between the two platforms. The game itself plays as expected and offers good support for controllers, with rumble functionality and smooth analog input. I did notice a couple of annoyances with mouse and keyboard input though. The menus still don't have proper cursor support just like the PC version, and closing the game requires entering a combination shortcut or force quitting, as the backspace key that's indicated in the menus is not actually featured on most Mac keyboards. As you actually start playing the game, however, you'll probably notice issues with periodic stutters. Yes, it seems like the infamous stutter struggle with shader compilation is indeed an issue with this game on Mac. My initial playthrough of this section on my Mac Studio at 1080p is a stuttering mess, for instance, with frequent and obtrusive stutter. But a second playthrough runs perfectly fine at a locked 60 FPS as you would expect. Apple actually does offer a fully offline shader compilation option in their latest version of Metal, compiling shaders when building game projects. With a relatively low number of system configurations, pre-compiling shaders seems like a pretty reasonable way to tackle this issue. Unfortunately, Resident Evil 8 on Mac doesn't seem to take advantage of this feature and suffers from profound stuttering issues. Outside of the shader compilation issues, performance seems reasonable but is pretty unexceptional on the whole. My MacBook Pro is typically in the 30 to 40 FPS range at native 4K here, while the Mac Studio is usually at 50 FPS or above. A Windows laptop with a 3080M clocks in with pretty similar performance to the Mac Studio. Given the quality of the graphics hardware on Mac, you'd probably expect a little bit better performance there, but it's not wildly out of line with Windows performance with comparable graphics hardware. Ultimately, those figures are sort of irrelevant though, as this game is best enjoyed with MetalFX quality on Mac. I'd probably recommend running at max settings at 1800p with MetalFX quality on the M1 Max, and 2160p with MetalFX quality on the M1 Ultra. I prefer MetalFX quality rendering to native rendering in this particular game, so there's really no compromise in terms of image quality or stability. But it's important to keep in mind here that regardless of the settings that you use, you will suffer from significant issues with stutter. Undoubtedly, the highlight of Resident Evil Village on Mac is its image reconstruction. MetalFX quality convincingly takes a quarter resolution image to an approximation of native res, with a stable, smooth, and detailed image. Apple has achieved something quite impressive here, and it would be great to get some insights into how the technique works, because the publicly available materials are light on implementation details. We do know, however, that the scale factor can be set to a lower value than the 2x scale that we are seeing here. So the technique could be used to upsample 1440p to 4K, for instance, with presumably significantly improved results. macOS is a pretty marginal gaming platform, of course, but this technology is supported in iOS 16 and iPadOS 16. For the rare mobile games that genuinely push sophisticated graphics, this could be a big win for frame rates and battery life. Resident Evil Village itself is a pretty mediocre port if you put the upsampling aside. The game is seemingly awash in shader compilation stutter, and lacks the ray tracing featured on current-gen consoles and PC. If Capcom can fix the stuttering issues, this will be a serviceable enough porting effort, but at the moment, I would recommend playing it elsewhere. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.